You're listening to Conversations with Loulou. I'm joined today by Philip Bahoshi, founder and CEO of Magnet, the largest investment data and trends platform for the MENA startup ecosystem. Philip is an interesting character. He studied economics and started his career in financial services. Within a few years, when he was 27, Philip was itching to get away from the corporate world and even the Middle East. So he went to INSEAD for his MBA.
And I was enamored by the idea of entrepreneurship and did all of their modules. It wasn't a core requirement of the university, but you were able to do all of the electives. And really what sparked my interest was that one particular weekend, like they do here, the startup bootcamp weekend, they had for students. And I vividly remember going on a Friday evening, and they tell you it's going to be super intensive. You sat in a room, come up with ideas, and by the end of the weekend on Sunday, you're pitching to investors. And in that 2-day process, you went from idea origination, you talked about board structures, you talked about cap tables, you talked about market size, and each thing was 30 minutes, and you had to like literally do them bite size. And so I had an idea about a wine app that basically is similar to Vivino. And during that time, one of the things they wanted you to do was to reach out to the alumni to get feedback on your product. And I went on what was the internal platform and emailed about 20 people. And only one person replied. And I just thought it was ridiculous that you're emailing random people you've never spoken to, asking them for feedback when they may have absolutely no interest in what it was that you were doing. Long story short, I go and join the family business, decided to stop that after 9 months, a year. And one of the things that really hit me was that we did this class. I've said this a few times. We studied at the time blue ocean strategy, out of the box thinking. What is it that is revolutionary? One of the modules was Match.com. And Match.com at the time was the premier, still considered to many, dating site. And what they had done was do a psychometric 15, 20-page analysis test to understand everything about you, to guarantee you your perfect match, and charged in the region of $1,000 to $2,000
Wow.
to do that, right?
Okay, wow.
And so we're sitting there in the room with like 100 students, and they're going on about how, the psychometric text testing, perfect match, introduction, you have to do due diligence. And literally, whoever was single in the room, Tinder had just been released, was sitting there swiping left, swiping right. Okay. Absolutely no testing, no guarantee, no monetization, just providing a channel for two people to meet. And what struck me fascinating when I was thinking about that later was from a entrepreneur investor perspective. You had all of these websites, whether it be Angel List, whether it be at the time Deal Room, or there was Gust, all requiring pitch decks, financials, information, data, potential of like investing with a percentage stake, etc. And yet all you really wanted to do was try and find an audience that was trying to be interested in what you do and connect them. And that was the original spark to Magnet, was, well, how do you Tinderize or simplify the process of connecting two people that may be interested in a concept and getting them to potentially lead to success or failure, but making that connection happen.
But why did you, you could connect, several people trying to do several things. So why did you decide on startups, and investors? That's quite niche.
No, I pivoted, right? So at the beginning, it took a long time to get traction. I've done so many mistakes at the beginning, whereby an outsourced development team, I did it on my own. I didn't have a co-founder. I tried to get traction. The truth was, with the MBAs, each university loved the idea, but none of them wanted to have a single platform that crossed MBAs. They wanted a product for their MBAs, almost a idea testing platform, not a angel list type platform. The second learning was that how was I meant to build a really strong business from Dubai when INSEAD is in Singapore? I spoke to the Dean of Harvard's entrepreneurship in the US, NYU, you got to Stanford. I spoke to all of them. Like, it wasn't without trying. I spoke to every top tier Ivy League and university from Europe in the MBA space. And all of them had great feedback, but you could just get 15 to 30 minutes on a Skype call with them. And that wasn't a way to build a business. It was almost like you needed to speak to people that were within your area. So I think probably 9 to 12 months in, I just decided, well, this isn't quite working with the MBA thing, but like I built the platform, the MVP's there. Why don't I get rid of MBAs and focus on the Middle East? And that would have been probably early 2016. And so I remained on this kind of connectivity platform for the Middle East. And what people liked the idea, and it was kind of cute at the time. And again, I could show you the numbers from Magnet, but at the time there wasn't a huge amount of investment and there wasn't a huge amount of activity. I still remember kind of pitching at the STEP conference at the time, which was down by Dubai Marina. And people were like, yeah, it's nice, and etc. And so the second time it was like really struggling. So we started adding these features and directories.
It's nice as in like they weren't.
It was a nice to have.
Convinced that there's a need.
There's a need for a matching platform. Everyone would be like, well, how many entrepreneurs are there? How many investors are there? How big is the market? How are you going to scale? How are you monetizing? I hadn't thought of the monetization at the time. And yet, like, I still believe that it was growing, and what we started to do was build the directory. So we moved away from the matching towards a directory. We started incorporating some elements of the news. We started incorporating bits of different elements. And I will always remember and thank Mai from Aventus. I used to work out of a co-working space here. And she sat next to me one day. I could see I was really frustrated. And she goes, what's wrong? And I was like, well, I just, people aren't getting what we do. And she said, well, you have 2,000 startups at the time. Nobody has that data. And I cross-checked that international platforms didn't have that data. And so she said, why don't you just put a graphic out there, put something visual? So I went on Canva, and I'm an ex-consultant, started putting a couple of little graphics together, had a few interns that were working with me that could make it a little pretty. And we brought out what was off the back of the Payfort State of MENA payments. We created the State of MENA startups, which was a 2-page infographic. Okay. How many startups? Where were they located? And we asked these questions. How many were fundraising? What stages they were at? We had all of this as part of the platform. And so we put this graphic out, and then all of a sudden people were going, oh, that was really nice. That was really informative. And then at the end of the year, I said, well, if that worked, let's do funding. Because I was looking at what other people in the space were doing here, and I didn't believe the numbers that were being bounced around. And we had all of the data because we'd been collecting it. So at the end of the year, we created what was the first MENA Venture Investment Report for the region. And that's when everybody started going, you're not just this matching platform, you're actually a data platform.
You were interested in entrepreneurship, but then you did the kind of the bootcamp, the startup bootcamp. So which brings me to a question. I mean, I've always, when I look at or when I read what's happening in the region, there's, I think, an incubator or an accelerator launching every month, maybe. Yeah. I don't have the data, but
we have the data.
How many?
I don't have the number, but we have the data.
It must be like around 100, maybe, in the region, probably. Like,
if you consider the MENA region, the 18 countries, I wouldn't be surprised if you included co-working spaces, incubators, accelerators. There's probably over 100.
So do you see value in that?
Look, I mean, it depends how you look at it. We want to bring out a report just on the success rate of accelerator programs, because I think that there are different type of accelerator programs. The challenge here is that the names are kind of intertwined. An incubator will consider itself to be an accelerator because there may be a program attached to it. An accelerator may give a grant, it won't take equity. So it's more of a equity, a grant-based program rather than it being a pure accelerator program. And co-working spaces here will use real estate as an opportunity to monetize on the licensing requirements, for instance, in the UAE, rather than it being a cost-effective mechanism by which to bring in and cluster people together, which may not be the case if you go to other jurisdictions. But to your question, are they successful? I think a lot of them have wised up on that. Let's see, when they originated, they served a purpose. Early stage investment in the region lacks an angel community because effectively it's still a new asset class. You can go back 10 years, and you know this much better than I. It was still very new for the region. Internationally, not so much, but here in the region, it was very new. And so who was funding at the early stage? Yes, 7, 8 years ago, there were a couple of VCs that started emerging that were having to play in the early stage. So these accelerator programs also kind of helped fund, as they still do today, the origination of early stage ideas. But not only did they give you cash, they kind of gave you some tools and teaching. But the terms that they provided were extremely punitive. But at the time, they were the first movers, and they were able to do that because entrepreneurs were desperate for cash. As you've seen more accelerator programs, and as you've seen founders wise up, use the internet, educate themselves of what the terms should be, as lawyers have become more vocal on what the terms should be, terms have become more favorable, while still somewhat punitive, more favorable for startup founders to go to these programs. And no doubt the success rate will come in the future as those companies kind of graduate.
What's I mean, would you say like the average equity you have to give out in a incubator or accelerator? Is it around 5 to 10%?
I mean, it should be around 5%, like no more than maximum 10%, but there were stories of 20, 30% for...
So we'll look forward for that report then.
Yeah, to get the average benchmarks, yeah, I mean, we want to bring out the average benchmarks.
I think it'll be interesting to know, you know, because if you are thinking about joining one, you'd want to know, are you getting a good deal or not really?
I mean, you're doing it in exchange for a whole program. And again, so you need to look at, is it a good program? Is it a good venture capital? Are they likely to bring in follow-on investors?
Knowing what you know today, what would you say like the most important, let's say, output that an incubator or an accelerator can provide you?
I think it's really like challenging what it is that you're doing. So ultimately, that's what the Startup Bootcamp was. That was not an accelerator. It was a 2-day program that literally just said, well, have you thought of this? How are you going to monetize? Who's it going to grow? How big is your market share? I think sometimes people become very obsessed with their ideas, that they get blinded by some simple questions. So if I was to do it all over again, would I have chosen a niche product without monetization, without a co-founder in a small market? Like, probably not, right? No, definitely not. I know you need to think of a very different kind of idea. And by the way, let me be clear to anyone listening, I did a whole MBA for all of the electives that told me all of this. But ultimately, until I did it myself and realized it through pain, it's a lot harder than when you just have an idea and you think it's going to become the next best thing.
I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think, you know, you follow an instinct, a passion, and you pursue it. And then
I believe that there's passion, but you need to be able to maneuver and change and not be driven. Passion can be almost blinding if you don't choose to change that passion.
I read it somewhere. It's not like an original idea of mine, but I can't remember who said it. But passion fades at some point, and it's that discipline to do it again and again and again and again. So a couple of things. We were once talking, you and I, and you said that you think that the most self-defeating feature that is quite common in entrepreneurs in this part of the world is defensiveness.
If you're going to somebody to ask them for advice, or you're asking them for feedback, you're basically opening yourself up to getting constructively criticized. Now, if they're telling you, Philip, Magnet's too small and the market's too small and you don't know how to monetize and etc., and you react to every single point, it is very unlikely that they're going to actually be constructive. They'll just be like, this person doesn't want to listen. And you almost want to kind of meander and have a conversation with them. It's like, okay, fine, but like, why? I'd love to hear more. What do you think is an alternative? Or that's fine. So how can I improve this? And therefore you go back to them with kind of what you've done to either address that, or you go back to them a couple of days later and say, look, I thought about what you said, but data has shown X, Y, Z is actually the truth. And it's happened to me so many times. More than anything else is when you are offering advice and that's the reaction, you just close up and stop giving the advice. If the person doesn't want to listen to you, it's not interesting for you. That's not the type of person that you want to support. Whereas if the person says, okay, interesting, let's have a conversation around this, you'll remember that conversation. So when they come and ask you a second time for advice, you'll be like, yeah, so what have you done about this? Did you think about these things? If the person is just defensive and criticizes you for being critical, you're not going to have that second conversation. And that applies 100% to investors as well.
So do you have mentors? Do you have advisors? How important is that? I mean, if you're starting up or even if you're growing a business, especially that you don't have co-founders, for example, and like you're on your own.
So I had a board of advisors when I started, and they were instrumental. Nobody can claim to be an expert in everything, and if you pick the right kind of advisors and mentors, they can support you with what you're doing. I'm in a very fortunate position where through what I do, I get to speak and meet, whether it's through conferences, events, very successful entrepreneurs in the region, and there's a genuine appreciation between us. Like yourself, I mean, there was a time I came to you and I asked for advice and support. I thank people like Magnus from Kareem has been very helpful in having conversations, Eli, who you're speaking to. And it's very inspiring because when you speak to them, number one, you realize many of the challenges that you're facing they've all gone through themselves. But I've also had other mentors that I can speak to who come from industry. I mean, one mentor of mine comes from the industry that we're in and has been extremely influential in supporting me and helping what I do. Sometimes it's just a good sanity check to tell you that you're going in the right direction.
So do you think people are more open to sharing for the sake of, everyone's learning? Or do you feel that information... access to information is
no, I think this part of the world
difficult.
Is still in this part of the world. I think we're still behind in terms of information sharing. I think that is
why.
I think it's hereditary to a certain extent. It's cultural. I'm sure a lot of it has to come down to culture.
So it's like a zero-sum game, right? Like if I win, somebody, or if they win, I'm losing.
Or people don't like sharing information out of shame or stigma. People love sharing success here, but failure, challenges, issues is not something that you're necessarily... it's not just here. I mean, that's the rest of the world. But when it gets normalized in other parts of the world, people become a lot more open to sharing that. And just look at data. I mean, it goes up, it goes down. We've had economic cycles. If you look at the stock market, it goes up, there's been crashes. So there's an acceptance that there is a cyclical nature to it. Venture has only been around 10 years, so people are still wanting to see the numbers go up every year over year, here in the world. This part of the world. And so people don't like the idea that there isn't good news. And I think that people need to embrace the idea. I wrote in my report that one of the predictions for next year is that people need to embrace the idea of there will be more failure.
I saw that, and I was going to ask you about it. Obviously, when I first started up in 2012, for us, raising money was like a big success or something to share. But again, I don't think it's because we as entrepreneurs thought so, but for some reason it got celebrated by the media. So actually, I don't know who's the culprit here, if it's us or if it's the media that kind of blew things out of proportion. And now, every time I see an announcement like X raises 10 million, Y raises whatever, and I think I would love to know like what their revenues are, you know? Like, are they profitable? Are they not profitable? I would love to see an announcement one day, hopefully on Magnet, saying, X company has done 100 million in revenue or something. I mean, because what are we celebrating? I mean, is it like, is it a stamp that you're successful because you raised 10 million?
I mean, look, I get the criticism all the time, and I would be wrong to sit here and suggest that we aren't fueling that through Magnet, because every time we get a major announcement,
But you're sharing, right?
But we're sharing the data.
You're
right?
not writing these reports. You're
no,
sharing.
but we'll get the press releases and we'll from the startups themselves, and we share the information around that.
So you're the culprit.
Well, you can call us a culprit, but I look at it from a data perspective. So we don't share any announcement if we don't have the amount. We won't share it if we don't get the stage. We, in every funding announcement that we'll share, we'll say who the investors are, who the founders are, what the industry is, what the stage is at. That's data. So what becomes interesting is that if you start looking at it by stage, if you look back 2 years ago, an average seed round investment would have been 500. Now you're reaching 1.52 million mega deals of 5 million seed rounds. Right. Well, that's transparency of data.
That's great, by the way.
Yeah. So that's transparency of data.
That's very helpful. But
the second part of what you're saying is, if you went back to Magnet 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I could tell you stories of VCs not wanting to share investments because they didn't want it being out in the public.
Like who they invested in?
Who they invested in, and then how much was invested in them.
So in case it doesn't work out, that means,
I can't speak on their behalf. I just know that they wouldn't share it. And then the entrepreneur, and it's funny because the entrepreneurs will blame the investors will blame the entrepreneurs. Who's the truth? You never know. But the truth was, once we started publishing these things, then people started going, well, but you didn't announce ours. It was like, you didn't give it to us. They're like, oh, but we'll give it to you. It's like, you didn't want to give it to before. Yeah, but now we want to. So my point being, well, you've got to start somewhere. So if all we're doing now is getting the announcements, then we're getting the basic data. Who knows? Maybe we get to a point where people do get comfortable sharing their run rates, their revenue rates. I can understand the conflict there because you're really stripping yourself open to people. But you've got to start somewhere to begin to get more levels of data that becomes useful. Ultimately, our goal from the data pillar that I was mentioning is to get more granular data, even if they're proxies or averages or reference points for people, because there is a lot more underlying data on Magnet than is publicly available. But if that was aggregated, it can become a reference. I was in a 500 startups retreat, and it was a panel on VC discussions. And the question from the moderator was, so what's one of your biggest pain points? And one of the investors said, oh, well, we believe that entrepreneurs in the region have very unrealistic valuations, and it's extremely frustrating because they come to us here and then we're always having to kind of tell them here. And then Ala from Jamalon was sitting next to me, who's a rock star, puts his hand up and he goes, but I don't understand. We, as entrepreneurs, believe that you have the wrong valuations because you're too low. And then what happens is that we end up in this horse haggling and then we go to the middle. And so I kind of got up and said, well, don't you believe that part of the issue is that there is a lack of transparency around this? If there was a benchmark to say, on average, the average seed investment is X, Series A is Y, Z, etc. And then your discussion becomes justify why you believe you should be higher than the norm, or investor why we believe you should be lower than the norm. The conversation becomes somewhat more neutralized and like kind of centered around facts and numbers than just random numbers that don't make sense. And hence that's one of the things that we try to push out, is to try and put out the averages and information around this so that people can go, right, well, that was the average last year, it's lower this year, it's higher next year. And that's part of what we're trying to solve for.
First, a comment on like the data that you give. I think it's amazing because at the time when I was raising a seed round, there were no benchmarks. I had no idea what a seed round in this part of the world should be. Also, obviously, it helps more if it's industry specific. So a seed round and transport is this, but
you can get all of that on the Magnet.
That's amazing, by the way. That's super helpful. What would be great to know as well are like maybe some of the metrics, right? So if you're doing an A round, it means you have revenues of X, or so again, as you said, you can justify why your valuation is lower and higher, or how you're doing as a vis-a-vis the market. I think that would be like extremely helpful. You said that there were $740 million worth of investments done in 2019. what percentage is that 740 million of the total funds that have been announced? Because, I mean, you just sent an email today about 1 billion dirham. 1 billion dirham fund. I mean, you have Hub 71, right? With also, I think, a huge fund.
So we have a rough estimate of funds that have been made publicly available. The challenge becomes what the headline is not clear how that then gets percolated into actual investments.
Yeah,
what is the vesting
frame?
period?
Yes.
What's the time period? What are they investing in? Are they fund of funds? Are they investing in VCs? Who are the VCs that they're investing in?
How do you approach them?
Or what is the mandate of them? Is it for their country? If it's in Saudi, is it for Saudi? Is it if it's in the UAE, is it for the UAE? And so the headline is one thing, how that money then gets deployed is another. But a good example is the Al-Waha Fund of Funds, which was a $100 million fund of funds in Bahrain, was then deployed. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but it's about 60 to 70% has already been deployed. And there are VCs that have already received in their closed new funds that have come from the Al-Waha Fund. So it would be wrong to say that the money isn't going to the institutions, but it definitely isn't very transparent how it's being deployed.
Exactly.
Correct.
And
what the
how
requirements
many deals
are.
And who's getting it. Absolutely.
Correct.
That's.
But I also think that takes time. Like we could name every one of those announcements were probably in the last 12, if not 18 months, except for the Al-Waha one, which I think is 2 years ago. That means it takes time for the paperwork, the organization, the bureaucracy of it, the legislation around it, then the money, then the deal flow, the selection process, the deployment. There's a couple of steps that you need to get to before that actually gets into the bank of an entrepreneur. But again, we'll have this conversation. I said it was $1 billion next year. I'll stick to that for the time being. Part of that is on the assumption that some of these funds will begin to get put into VCs and deployed before the end of the year. Whether we hit the $1 billion mark will be seen, and hope that not too many of the big startups get exited and they don't get their follow-on funds, because that's part of that journey. Again, I go to a conversation that I had in 5, and I think it was my first startup meetup back in 2014, 15. And there was a gentleman that was extremely angry, Saudi gentleman, who was an entrepreneur. And he was on stage and he says, Aib, haram on the investors for not investing in Middle Eastern startups. All of these VCs and LPs that invest abroad should have shame on them for not investing in the local ecosystem. And I remember a gentleman whose name I won't mention said, I'm sorry, but again, if you have a proven record elsewhere and it is your money to invest, why must you invest in the region if you are looking for a return? If you choose to do it as part of a diversified approach, whereby you invest 75% abroad and 25% here, and you can see returns in the long run, and you believe and have an emotion towards it, then maybe they'll choose to do so. But there's absolutely no requirement to do so based on purely location and geography.
But would you say, Philip, that there's no returns because there are no investments to match basically what people are investing?
I think that's part of the argument.
I mean, you would never, I mean, you go to Silicon Valley, you are a global startup from day one. You would never meet.
No, I think that's a fallacy.
No. But you never meet a founder, okay, of a Silicon Valley startup that tells you, well, I'm solving for a problem in San Francisco.
I think that many of them did. No, I disagree with you.
They started off.
Their market, all of them.
They started off, but the vision wasn't that. Whereas if you talk to entrepreneurs in the Middle East, usually like they're solving for a problem in Egypt or in Dubai or so like in MENA.
I don't agree and I agree.
But why can't we create global startups?
I think that will come, but to answer your first question, I actually disagree. A lot of people will say, oh, global startups coming out of Silicon Valley. Yes, when you look at the success stories, it's very easy to be biased by the success stories to say that every startup that started in Silicon Valley became a global phenomena.
I'm not saying, I didn't say it became, I said the mentality is...
Mentality is actually probably that they want to become a massive US company that then allowed them to become a global company. I'm not convinced that they all started off. And again, I haven't been Silicon Valley, but I can think of it from a mindset perspective. Now, you are not wrong in saying that you want to be a very big startup in Kuwait or Dubai or Abu Dhabi. I think the difference is they're already thinking, how do we penetrate the US, which is 350, 400 million people. Yes. Here it's, the region is very complicated. Let's just try and be big even in Egypt without thinking about the rest of the region. So I do agree that startup founders, if they want to play in the venture game, again, that means a scalable return startup. My definition for a startup effectively is a company that will receive venture investment or seeks venture investment. Because if you don't seek venture investment, then you're not a high-tech, scalable...
or high growth
platform. The second part of your question, though, is to have pure innovation. And this is the question I keep getting asked. Copycats is the region. Copycats are great. If you can create, in my opinion, a startup, the second part of the definition is to create efficiency where inefficiency exists using technology, then there's nothing wrong with localizing international products to create a market that didn't previously exist. I think that's fine.
It's fine.
But if you want pure innovation, that requires a huge amount of investment in research and development and coding. Those guys in Silicon Valley were doing it themselves. I would love to do a research report on how many founders here did it themselves and didn't use outsourced teams, outsourced people from Pakistan, India, Egypt, Jordan, but had an idea, because there you can iterate and grow the company. But ultimately, you need research and development.
So a point on the exits. I mean, you mentioned earlier, obviously some people made some money now with quite a bit of money actually with Kareem and with Souk before. And do you think though, I mean, would you rather see in an ecosystem 100 companies exit at 100 million or 5 companies exit at $1 billion or
both?
$3 billion?
I'm happy for 100 million.
But are you seeing those today, or are we? I mean, we have Kareem, which obviously no one's gotten close to that when it comes to the technology startups, and Souk, I think, as a second, right?
Souk, but then I think you have companies like Namshi, Wadi. You can go back. You had Zawiya, Talabat. Delivery Hero.
So that's positive in your views?
I think so.
So you don't think that we need more, maybe smaller exits, but like a bigger
so I think
volume?
You're seeing two things. You're seeing consolidation taking place, whereby if you look at the e-commerce and transport and logistics space, there are a lot of companies doing the same things across a wide region. And for them to become interesting for a bigger acquisition, M&A has begun to take place. The second thing is corporates are becoming more interested in startups than ever before and beginning to acquire companies that can help digitalize their offline businesses into online businesses. But number 3 is that the international players, and we've seen this, international investors, either investing or directly or through their portfolio companies, are fueling their portfolio companies to acquire companies in the region, are interested in the Middle East. And that's healthy. Because it has a return, it provides a path or light at the end of the tunnel for the entrepreneur. It means that employees of those companies have a stamp of approval that they've been part of a journey that has successfully exited. And by the way, I don't believe any exit is a bad exit. Speak to investors, they say that's not true. A bad exit is not good for them. Sure. But if you're an entrepreneur that exited, even if it's a buyout or a what do you call it, an employee buyout, you still have a stamp on your CV for that journey for you to go and raise again, assuming that you want to be a serial or second-time entrepreneur that's interested in doing it again. And therefore, again, I go back to the point that if it takes 7 to 8 years to exit, and if you went back 7 to 8 years and there was hardly, probably less than 1,000 or 2,000 startups across the whole of MENA, and that's counting like everyone with an idea, it takes time for them to get to a point where they're big enough, had enough funding, had enough growth to become interesting for exit. And hence we expect that to accelerate. But to your question, is it better to have $5 billion or 100 million? Have 100 million. That's a lot of return for investors if they were early stage investors. That's a lot of wealthier entrepreneurs that have left their companies. I'm no doubt convinced that in the region, there are a lot of entrepreneurs who have been doing this now for 6, 7 years, who are literally like, I spoke to one guy, I'm not going to say who it is, and he goes, Phil, we're not working on our $1 billion company right now. We're going to sell this company to create the $1 billion company, because we finally learned what's actually required to do that. But we had to go through this exercise to be able to do that.
So what do you think is, are the exciting industries moving forward?
At its core, when you look at the Middle East or any emerging market, infrastructure is the first industry that looks to be disrupted using technology. This year, we saw fintech overtake all other industries by number of investments. Now, that is an infrastructure industry that requires disruption at a global level, but especially at a regional level. And interestingly, despite this very strong media attention, shall we say, to AI and blockchain and cryptocurrency and all of these things, 50% of all startups that received investments did payments and remittances.
Interesting. So what has changed, you think, in the ecosystem in the past? You've been
4 years.
4 years or
yeah.
5 years,
5
I think.
years.
Yeah. So I would say, like, what do you think are some of the big changes that you've noticed, and what's your sort of advice? I know, like, everybody asks that question, like, what's your advice to entrepreneurs? I find it very cliche, but I mean, you sit in a really interesting position because you see a lot of data, much more than the average entrepreneurs.
If you're not ready to give up the next 10 years of your life to potentially be successful in the idea that you have now, then it's not really worth giving it a go. Because the best case scenario is that works out. Worst case, it could be 15, 20 years. Worst case is it fails after 2, 3. But if you're not ready to psychologically put yourself in that position, and that means financially, it means personal, it means health, it means psychological, it means many of those aspects, I would always encourage somebody to join a company, to work out what it means to work for a startup on somebody else's dime, get the bug, learn what the work environment is, learn what some of the challenges are. It used to frustrate me before where certain people would go out and quit university and quit your job and start a company. I felt that it was very, it's wrong to encourage people because they're inspired by great speakers or by great ideas or by the great success stories in the pursuit of encouraging entrepreneurship to just quit their lifestyle inspired by someone when they haven't explained that, well, I do it, but have you thought about your kids or the kids' education or your housing and your rent? And by the way, it might take you a good 12 to 18 months to get to a point of monetization and have that sounds very mechanical, but ultimately, if you haven't thought that far ahead, then you're being somewhat naive, which many entrepreneurs are when they start. Again, when I started, I'm not going to name a startup that came and spoke to the co-working space I was at. It was one of the first talks that they did. And it's a well-known startup here, but the question somebody asked was, how long did it take you to raise $1 million? And the guy said, oh, it took us a good 5 years to get to raise $1 million. And everyone in that room had been there for 6 months, had this gasp. They're like, this couldn't have been a very good startup, or why did they take that long? And you just assume that people want to give you money. And the truth of the matter is, again, it's not charity. There's so many aspects to getting to it. So my recommendation is go in with a mindset that if you're not ready to sacrifice for the next 10 years, it's probably best to join one and learn what it is to do it. Do your research. Learn about the dark side of entrepreneurship as well as the upside before you get into it. And ultimately, test your product. I mean, don't go and put all your money into something until you begin to get feedback, and not positive pandering from your friends and family, but from people that actually, your customers, are people ready to pay for what it is that you want to build? And if not, why and how do you get them to?
Since you mentioned family, you come from an entrepreneurial family, right? Is that something that encouraged you to become an entrepreneur?
I was always inspired by having independent, non-corporate companies from that. I mean, they come from a very different world of the offline business and not tech. The reason I wanted to get into the family business was to grow it and diversify it beyond what it was. And that was the real desire from it. But at some point I realized, well, you need to create your own path and destiny, and you can't necessarily just replicate what was done before. And if you want to be successful, you may just need to take the risk and do it on your own. That was where I decided, cool, how about let me not just replicate what was done. And many people have that affinity to their fathers and dream to support and follow in their footsteps. But there was a certain point, which I'll always never forget, that it's actually okay to just create your own new footsteps and use that inspiration to do it your way as opposed to what was done historically.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Philip. That
Thank
was
you very much.
amazing.